question in particular I wanted to ask you, Dr. Murphy, just in response to your submission, the task submission states the distribution of care work in society plays a central role in the formation of inequality between men and women. Essentially, the fact that women provide the overwhelming amount of child, elder and other forms of care mean that they have often been excluded. And I also presume that you include in that participate in a more limited way, not just excluded, but participate in a more limited way, or in a more difficult way, possibly, from political, economic, but also voluntary, cultural and leisure activity. And my question is, I was just thinking about the interactions, Chair, that I've had with just constituents over the last couple of days about getting back to work, finding a childcare place and getting back to work, and if there was a risk, the danger fell to her, not him, you know, and these are, you know, young couples we're very committed to gender equality as well, and I certainly am not trying to, I'm certainly not trying to criticise all men or any of those things, but when I speak to my constituents, it comes up again and again, the day-to-day disparity between the care responsibility or the assumption of care responsibility between men and women. I even see it in WhatsApp groups. Hello, ladies. You know what I mean? I see it all over the place, and they're all little subtle things. I see women going back to work who are finding it difficult to. To find it difficult to ensure that the care burden, the care responsibility that they have assumed is now distributed more equally between partners. It's of course not the case that because you earn more you do less, or any in response, in relation to your family or anything else. And I suppose my question is this: from a perception perspective, from a social perspective, how do we convince and explain those men who think they are doing gender equality that in fact there's quite a lot more to do, and that it's a day-to-day thing that must be done? Can you help me with that, if there are perspectives on that? And it's not unique to Ireland. We've seen this across the reports from the EU. Frances Fitzgerald has pioneered a lot of work in this in the EU. I'm not saying anything unusual here. Am I?
No.
Okay.
So, no, thank you for that. Yes, I mean, it is a curious one we've observed over the last 2 years especially. I think there's interesting research from, I know of, at least from the UK, looking at how much change there was when people were experiencing lockdown measures of men doing routine household chores and routine care work that women normally take responsibility for. And you saw that just even the enforced working from home actually increased men's participation. So one is actually being in the home a little for more time, I think. And then the other thing on the social perspective on how we get more men to do more of routine caring that the women do. I feel on that one, it needs to, first incentives need to be there. So it would either have to be educational qualifications or pay.
Sorry, Dr. Murphy, I don't need to be educated or paid to, put out the bins.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. But it's. I think.
But I know what you're trying to say. It's very difficult to answer, isn't it?
Yeah. It's very hard to change. Yeah.
So could I ask you then as well, because this is the point, and it's actually I can see you struggling with the answer, because it is a difficult, and I even find it a difficult question to ask, because you can see that the response is, well, I do this and I do that and so on and so on. Yet we have this cumulative problem. We have this broad problem that's not just Ireland. That's not that's across Europe. And it happens at different stages of life and in different ways, and of course not in all cases, but it happens a lot, so much so that you put it in your submission. The EU is driving policy in relation to it, trying to highlight it post-COVID and so on. What role, for example, different form of relationship and sexual education, what role for education in this for the next generation, even if it's too late for the women that I've been speaking to in my constituency and maybe nothing will change for them, what role for education and if anybody else wants to come in, I really would be appreciative of your perspective.
I suppose I should come in as an educator. I think first of all, I suppose we should never underestimate the degree to which our current male breadwinner system, our welfare system, our tax system, the nature of our education system, do orientate a culture of female care. So to some degree, it's understanding how the present culture is constructed and maintained is really important. So some of the rules we talked about earlier on about the eligibility systems for pensions, and generally speaking, they do reinforce in people's heads that there are gendered differences in relation to the household, the employment place, and the role of care. So we shouldn't be surprised maybe that we get the culture that we get because we set out to make it in some respects, and that's why maybe looking at the Constitution is that important thing. All of those kind of rules and norms and values permeate through our culture, our education, our churches, our even our GAA systems or whatever, back into how we construct it. And if we look at what other societies have been trying to do, a lot of the time it's trying to find other policy tools to try and reorientate the culture. So whether it's forcing the loss of parental leave in the family if there isn't an equal sharing of it between the male and the female as a start to try and do it. But of course that only works if it's accompanied by other measures to try and change employers' attitudes towards facilitating men to take care leave in the workplace. Same with the idea of a 4-day working week, which has a lot of gender equality potential, but tends not to be pushed in that context. And it tends to be, there's campaigns for a 4-day week, which are about working less to live more, but then there's a gender equality aspect that's kind of stitched on. So it could be about working less to care more, but often the joined up thinking isn't there about how some policy changes that are good can also be used to change culture. I think in relation to education, I would be quite, we talk a lot, for example, at the moment about how we need to integrate into our education system much more focus on sustainability as a cultural shift so that our children and our young people are very orientated towards climate change. We don't have that same conversation about care. Like we really don't. We could do if we choose to. So we're not quite there yet in terms of looking for the cultural value change. I often, that the song, The Town I Love So Well, and that line in it where the men on the dole play the women's role. And they laugh through the smoke and the smell. It really annoys me, that song sometimes. But I think it's so embedded deeply that there is this expectation of roles. And some of the academic research is quite interesting in the cultural shifts that do happen when there is a major recession or a big cultural change like the pandemic or something. And they're trying to see is, does 1 or 2 years of a shift in care roles that's brought about by a structural shift, does that actually embed? And some of the research shows it doesn't actually. Or that there are class differences in how it embeds. So when you link it with more education and other types of shifts in culture, yes, it does change. And the shift in the care roles begins to be embedded in the household practice when things return to normal. But other research shows that in a lot, and particularly in more working class situations, that the shift reverted back to the normalisation of gender roles when the structural shift went back to normal.
I'm interested in what you say there, and also what you said about the 4-day week and how that, and I think the chair is probably sick to the teeth of me giving the example of, a constituent of mine who was working in a senior commercial firm, partner also in a senior commercial firm. So you take that dynamic and you're trying to get more women across the board at, in every organisation, but particularly perhaps commercial organisations that have been so gendered in the past. Taking a 3-day week and him remaining at a 5-day week in order to address the care needs of their 2 young children instead of the blindingly obvious solution, which was 2 4-day weeks, as I think you've suggested, with all of the benefits of equality, pensions, opportunities, participation, and the normalisation of that in the commercial world, that it was a perfectly normal thing for a man to come in and request a 4-day week for 3 years to approach the care needs of their children.
Yeah, there are sort of theoretical models of how you might envisage this, where at the moment we tend to have a kind of commodified approach where we expect both parents to find the care in the marketplace and both of them to work full time. And a different way of thinking about that might be the 2 3/4 jobs as the societal norm, where both expect to play some role in the home and both expect to work a certain amount of time. And that they would also access some care in the care infrastructure that's available. And I would like to think that that's where we could be shifting, but it requires shifting a lot of policy towards working time policy, welfare policy, taxation policy, care policy, all need to be going in the same direction. And I think that's what Alice Mary was talking about when that macro welfare imagination is like, what's the compass pointing towards here? Like what we have is loads of good policies, but we don't particularly join them up in a vision of what we're trying to create as a culture around care or as an ethic around care. And that to me is missing from the conversation sometimes, is what's the goal of all this? Is it, you know, a gender neutral distribution of care between the family, the state and the market? That's, I think, the kind of, if it is that, then what do we need to do? Yeah. If we know where we're going, it's easier to start talking about, well, how do we get there? Yeah.
Ursula, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, I just, a couple of things around this. I mean, I think one of the things that research has shown, like across different countries, is that when we talk about the care burden, and you mentioned the care burden, that the management and the organisation of the household care needs comes down to women, even when both parties are both couples in a heterosexual couple are both full-time employees. The management, the organisation, the identify, like the hiring of the care place, or all of that, and there's been very little shift in that. So that responsibility comes down to women in the couple, and the research is very strong on that. But I suppose one of the things that, you know, we've introduced paternity leave recently, and that's a really good thing to have introduced. And I think that at the same time, we're still operating on the basis that, you know, there's 6 months maternity leave, and there's a number of weeks, or 6 months maternity leave, and there's a number of weeks paternity leave. So from the very outset, we're structuring a situation where the care responsibility is assumed to be primarily the woman's. And that kind of shift and change of culture would need, it's going to need time. It's not going to be done like very fast. I think there is evidence in the younger generation of more equal sharing of care responsibilities. And that's driven a lot by men's expectations of having closer connection with their children and child rearing. It's not just about women. But another thing that has struck me from what you're saying is I've been involved in a research network at European level around gender equality for a lot of years. And one of the things that's fascinated me is that when care is talked about in the Nordic countries, or Denmark and Norway and Sweden or whatever, and Finland in particular, actually, when care is talked about, it's talked about not in order to facilitate employment, but it's talked about in terms of the quality of those in receipt of care. And that includes the care of young children. So the care of young children is not seen in the Nordic countries as a means to allow women to access paid work, but quality of care is seen as in the interest of the children themselves, and particularly children in working class areas, children in disadvantaged areas, for example. So it's seen as child-driven, not driven by employment policy. And that's quite an important distinction to make, you know, in terms of how our culture looks at the question of care. And I suppose the hybrid system that people have been thinking maybe will emerge out of the pandemic, there's less and less confidence that that's actually going to be the outcome, and more tendency to go back to what was pre-pandemic normalization. But one of the things I would say is that the percentage of women in administrative managerial jobs in the profession areas is increasing quite significantly in Ireland. And there is a level of seniority that women are achieving in those areas. And I think that's not going to go away, and that is going to change the nature of the conversation that happens at household level. And it changes the assumption that women's work is additional, whereas looking at women's paid work on an equal basis. And I think that will shift. And again, there is time involved, and cultural shifts do take time.